Alright, so this happened a few years ago when I was working at this small, family owned grocery store in my hometown. It wasn't anything fancy, just a local place where people came to grab essentials. The store had been around forever, and the layout was pretty straightforward: aisles of food, a few fridges, and a small back room where we kept extra stock and did our paperwork. The back room, though, was kind of strange. It wasn't like it was creepy right off the bat, but it had this vibe. It was cold, always colder than the rest of the store, and the lighting wasn't great. Just one or two fluorescent lights that flickered every now and then. The walls were a dull, worn-out gray, and the air smelled a bit musty, like old cardboard mixed with cleaning products. There were no windows, so when you were back there, it felt completely cut off from everything else. I didn't mind working there most days. It was easy enough: stocking shelves, ringing people up, sweeping the floors before closing. But it was those evening shifts, especially when I was left alone, that really made me uncomfortable. One night, I was closing the store with just one other person, my coworker Sarah. We were the last ones there, and it had been a slow night. Sarah was up front, cashing out the register, while I was in the back room, finishing up with some inventory. There were only a few hours left in our shift, and it was one of those nights where the minutes seemed to drag. The store was dead silent, save for the occasional hum of the fridges and the faint music from the radio Sarah had playing up front. I had been in the back room for about 20 minutes, going through some boxes of canned goods that had come in earlier that day. I wasn't in any rush, just trying to get everything organized before we locked up. As I was moving some boxes around, I heard this soft noise behind me. It was subtle at first, like the sound of something scraping against the floor, but it was enough to make me stop what I was doing. I turned around, expecting to see Sarah messing around, or maybe a box that had fallen over, but there was nothing. Just the same cold, dimly lit back room. I stood there for a second, listening, but everything was quiet again. I shook it off, telling myself it was probably just the building settling or something. You know how old places are, they make weird noises all the time. But a few minutes later, I heard it again. This time it was louder, a definite scraping sound, like something heavy was being dragged across the concrete floor. My stomach tightened, and I felt that familiar chill creep up my spine. It wasn't coming from where I was standing. It sounded like it was coming from the far corner of the back room, near where we kept the old stock that didn't get touched much. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, even though there was already light in the room. Something about holding a flashlight made me feel a little better, like I had some control over whatever was going on. I walked toward the back corner, slowly, the light from my phone bouncing off the shelves and boxes. When I got to the corner, everything looked normal. There was nothing out of place, no fallen boxes or anything that could have made that noise. But just as I was about to turn around and head back to the front, I noticed something strange. There was a door in the wall. Now, I know that sounds like no big deal, but here's the thing. I'd been working there for over a year, and I had never noticed this door before. It was small, almost hidden behind some boxes, and it looked old, like really old. The paint was chipped, and there was a layer of dust on the frame, which didn't make sense because the rest of the back room was cleaned regularly. The door had this small, rusty handle, and it didn't seem like it had been opened in a long time. My first thought was to call Sarah and ask her if she knew about it, but something made me hesitate. I don't know if it was curiosity or just plain stupidity, but instead of calling her, I reached out and grabbed the handle. It felt cold and gritty, like it hadn't been touched in years. I pulled, and the door creaked open with this slow, groaning sound. Behind it was a narrow hallway, pitch black, with walls made of the same gray concrete as the back room. The air that came out of it was freezing, way colder than the already chilly back room, and it smelled damp, like the inside of an old, abandoned basement. I stood there for a second, just staring into the hallway. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to shut the door and forget about it, but I couldn't. Something about it drew me in, like I had to know where it led, so I stepped inside. The moment I did, I felt like I'd made a mistake. The hallway was narrow, barely wide enough for me to walk through without brushing against the walls, and the further I went, the darker it got. My phone's flashlight didn't seem to do much. The beam of light was swallowed up by the darkness almost as soon as I stepped forward. The floor was uneven, with cracks running through the concrete, and the air felt thick, like it was pressing down on me. I walked for what felt like forever, but it was probably just a few minutes. The hallway twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense, like it was longer than the actual size of the store. It was disorienting, and I started to feel this growing sense of dread. What the hell was this place? Why was it here, hidden behind the shelves in the back room? Eventually, I reached the end of the hallway. There was another door, this one larger than the first, but in even worse shape. The metal was rusted, and the paint was peeling off in long strips. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the handle, but then I grabbed it and pulled. The door opened with a loud creak, and inside was a small, windowless room. It was empty, except for a single metal chair in the center of the floor. The chair was old and rusted, with paint chipping off in patches, and it was positioned under a bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The light was off, but it looked like it could still work if someone flipped a switch. I stood there, staring at the chair, my heart racing. The air in the room was even colder than the hallway, and it smelled like rust and damp concrete. I don't know why, but I felt like I shouldn't be in there, like I was intruding on something that wasn't meant to be found. Just as I was about to turn around and leave, I heard the door behind me slam shut. I whipped around, shining my flashlight on the door, but there was nothing there, just the same rusted metal door, closed tight. I ran to it, grabbed the handle, and tried to pull it open, but it wouldn't budge. My stomach dropped, and for the first time that night, I felt real panic set in. I was trapped. I pounded on the door, yelling for Sarah, hoping she would hear me from the front of the store, but the walls were thick, and the hallway had twisted and turned so much that I had no idea how far away I was. I kept pulling on the handle, trying to force the door open, but it wouldn't move. Then I heard it, the scraping sound again. It was faint at first, like it was coming from somewhere far away, but it was getting closer. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my hands were shaking as I shone the flashlight around the room. There was nothing there, just the chair and the cold, empty walls. But the scraping kept coming, louder and louder, until it sounded like it was right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing. That's when the light bulb above the chair flickered on. I froze. The light cast long, eerie shadows across the room, and the chair looked even more out of place under the harsh glow. I backed up against the door, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew I had to get out of there. I started pounding on the door again, harder this time, yelling at the top of my lungs. After what felt like an eternity, I heard a muffled voice on the other side. "Sarah?" The door creaked open, and there she was, standing in the hallway with a confused look on her face. I didn't wait for her to ask questions. I just pushed past her and bolted back down the hallway, back to the back room. When we got there, I slammed the hidden door shut and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. Sarah looked at me like I was crazy, asking what the hell had happened. I didn't know what to tell her. I couldn't explain what I had just experienced. And honestly, I didn't want to. I just grabbed my stuff, told her I wasn't feeling well, and left. I never went back into that back room after that night. I couldn't. Every time I thought about it, I got that same sick feeling in my stomach, like something was waiting for me behind that hidden door. I ended up quitting a few weeks later, and to this day, I can't explain what happened. All I know is that there are some places you're not meant to find, and that back room was one of them. Okay, so this happened a few years ago when I was working at this small retail store in my town. You know, the kind of place that sells everything from snacks to clothes and household stuff. The store wasn't huge, but it had enough space for a decent-sized stockroom in the back. I was usually on the night shift, which was perfect because it wasn't too busy, and I could get a lot done without many distractions. That stockroom, though, it always gave me weird vibes. It wasn't anything obvious, just something about it felt off. Maybe it was the flickering lights that never seemed to stay bright for long, or maybe it was how quiet it got back there. No matter what time of day, the air always felt stale, and you could never hear anything from the store once you were in the back. It was like stepping into a completely different world. Anyway, one night, it was just me and my coworker Sarah on the shift. We were pretty much done for the night. No customers for the last hour, and the store was dead quiet. Sarah was handling the register and closing up front, and I was in the back doing some last-minute inventory and organizing the new stock we'd gotten in earlier that day. I grabbed my clipboard, put in my earbuds, and headed into the back room to start counting boxes. It was routine stuff, moving things around, stacking shelves, the usual. But about 10 minutes into it, I heard something. It was faint, but definitely there, like a soft thud. I paused my music and looked around. The back room was packed with shelves, so I couldn't see everything from where I was standing, but it didn't sound like anything had fallen over. I brushed it off and went back to what I was doing, figuring maybe one of the boxes had shifted or something. But then I heard it again. This time it was a little louder, like something heavier had hit the ground. My first instinct was that maybe Sarah had come into the back room without me noticing, so I called out to her, but there was no answer. At that point, I started feeling uneasy. The store wasn't that big, and if Sarah had come back there, I would have heard her walk in. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and walked toward the far side of the back room where I'd heard the noise. The further back I went, the colder it felt. Not freezing, but enough to make me feel like something was off. When I reached the far wall, where we kept all the old cleaning supplies and stuff we didn't really use, I noticed something strange. One of the shelves had been pushed out of place, like it had been moved just slightly. There was a small gap between the shelf and the wall, and I swear that shelf hadn't been like that earlier. I didn't want to freak myself out, so I just told myself it must have shifted on its own, or maybe someone bumped into it earlier and forgot to fix it. But here's where it gets really weird. I crouched down to take a look behind the shelf, just to make sure nothing had fallen back there, and that's when I saw it. There was a door. It wasn't a regular door either. It was old, metal, and kind of rusted around the edges. There was no handle, just this small latch that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Now I'd been working at that store for months, and I'd never noticed this door before. It was completely hidden by the shelf, like it had been deliberately covered up. My first reaction was to back away, but then curiosity kicked in. I mean, who wouldn't want to know what was behind a door you'd never seen before? I grabbed the shelf and pulled it just enough to give myself space, then reached for the latch. The door creaked open, and this musty, cold air rushed out. It smelled like dust and damp concrete, like a basement that hadn't been aired out in years. I shone my flashlight inside, and what I saw made my heart race. It was a narrow hallway, barely wide enough for one person to walk through. The walls were concrete, cracked in some places, and the floor was covered in dirt and debris. The hallway stretched out in front of me, getting darker the further I looked. At this point, most people would have shut the door and walked away, but not me. Something about the whole thing had me hooked, even though I had this gnawing feeling in my gut that something wasn't right. I stepped into the hallway, the cold air clinging to my skin. My footsteps echoed off the walls, and the deeper I went, the more disconnected I felt from the rest of the store. The hallway wasn't long, but it felt like it stretched on forever. At the end of it was another door, this one even more beat up than the first. The paint was peeling, and there were deep scratches all over it, like someone had clawed at it in desperation. My heart was pounding by this point, and I had no idea what I was walking into. I reached for the latch, hesitating for a moment before pulling the door open. Inside was this small room, completely bare except for a single wooden chair in the center. The room was lit by a dim, flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling, but the light wasn't coming from the store's electricity. It was like it had its own power source, barely keeping it alive. The walls were covered in more of those same scratches, deep grooves that looked like they'd been made by someone or something trying to get out. I stood there, frozen, just staring at the chair. The air was so thick I could barely breathe, and I had this overwhelming sense that I wasn't supposed to be there. My flashlight shook in my hand, and I couldn't stop the panic that was rising in my chest. Then I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from the far corner of the room. I spun around, shining my flashlight in every direction, but there was nothing there, just the chair, the scratches on the walls, and that damn flickering light. The scratching got louder, like nails dragging against the concrete floor, and I could feel my heart pounding in my throat. I backed away slowly, not daring to turn my back on the room. The scratching continued, but there was still nothing there. No one, no sign of anything moving, just that sound, like it was crawling toward me. I bolted. I ran back down the hallway, not caring how loud my footsteps were, and slammed the door shut behind me. My chest was heaving, and my hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped my phone. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath, but I couldn't stop thinking about that room. What was it? Why was there a hidden door in the back of the store? And more importantly, what the hell was making that sound? I didn't go back to that part of the stockroom for the rest of my shift. When Sarah asked if I was okay, I just shrugged it off, told her I wasn't feeling well, and went home as soon as we closed. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that scratching sound again, like it was still following me. I ended up quitting that job a few weeks later. I never told Sarah or anyone else about the door or what I found back there. Part of me didn't want to know what it was, and part of me was scared that if I talked about it, I'd somehow bring it back. To this day, I still wonder what the hell that room was for, and why it was hidden in the back of a convenience store. But I'll tell you one thing, no matter how curious you are, sometimes it's better to leave things alone. It was about a year ago when I had one of the weirdest and most unsettling experiences of my life. I was working at this small electronics store in a strip mall, the kind of place where you don't really expect anything too crazy to happen. I was just trying to make some extra cash while I figured out what I wanted to do next. So I didn't mind the quiet, repetitive nature of the job. I worked mostly night shifts, and while it could get a little boring sometimes, it was easy money, or so I thought. The store wasn't big, just a front area with shelves full of gadgets, and a small back room where we kept extra stock. It was a pretty basic setup. The back room wasn't exactly somewhere I like to hang out in, though. It always had this weird vibe. It wasn't that anything ever really asterisk happened to asterisk back there, but it was dark, damp, and had a slight musty smell that never seemed to go away. The lights were those old fluorescent ones that buzz and flicker, and it was cold. Like way colder than it should have been for a room with no windows. I had been working the late shift one evening with just one other person, a coworker named Sarah. We didn't get a lot of customers in the evenings, so she was mostly at the front while I was in the back room, taking stock of some new items we had just received that day. Sarah was chatty, but when the store was quiet, we both kind of did our own thing. She handled the register, and I handled the back. It was one of those nights where time seemed to drag. No customers, nothing too exciting happening, just the dull hum of the lights and the occasional beep of the register when Sarah scanned something. I was back there, sorting through some boxes of chargers and cables, when I heard a noise. At first I thought it was just one of the boxes settling on the shelf, a dull thud that didn't seem too out of place. The building was old, so you'd hear creaks and pops sometimes. No big deal. But then it happened again, only louder. This time it wasn't a thud. It sounded like something scraping across the concrete floor. It was subtle, but enough to get my attention. I stopped what I was doing and listened. The back room was completely silent except for the faint buzzing of the lights overhead. I figured maybe Sarah had come back there without me noticing, so I called out to her, but there was no response. The sound wasn't coming from anywhere near the door where she might have entered. It was coming from the far corner of the back room, where we kept old stock and random items that didn't get used much. The strange part was that we didn't really have anything in that corner that could make a sound like that. It was mostly boxes, some old displays, and a couple of broken shelves we hadn't gotten rid of yet. Curiosity got the best of me, so I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and started walking toward the noise. As I walked further into the back room, the temperature seemed to drop even more. It was already cold, but now it felt like I had stepped into a freezer. The air felt heavy, and my breath came out in small puffs of fog, which didn't make any sense. I shone my light over the shelves, scanning the corner where I thought the noise had come from. Everything looked normal, just the same dusty boxes and old shelving units. But then something caught my eye. There, on the floor, right in the middle of the far corner, was a small, old-looking door. It was low, like something you'd have to crawl through, and it was half hidden behind a stack of boxes. I swear I'd never seen that door before, and I had been working there for months. I crouched down to get a better look, and sure enough, it was a door. The paint was peeling, and the metal handle was rusted. It looked like it hadn't been opened in years. I don't know why, but I felt this strange pull to open it. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was just the weirdness of the situation. But I found myself reaching for the handle before I even realized what I was doing. The handle was cold and rough, and I had to yank it a couple of times before the door finally creaked open. Behind the door was a narrow, dark tunnel. It stretched on for what seemed like forever, disappearing into the shadows. I couldn't see the end of it, even with my flashlight. The air coming from the tunnel was even colder than the back room, and it had this strange earthy smell, like damp soil or old wood. At this point, every part of me was telling me to shut the door and walk away, but of course I didn't. I stepped inside. The tunnel was narrow, so narrow that I had to turn sideways to fit through, and the walls were rough, almost like they had been carved out of the earth by hand. I kept walking, my flashlight flickering slightly as I moved deeper into the tunnel. The further I went, the more claustrophobic it felt. The ceiling was low, and the walls seemed to press in on me from all sides. After what felt like forever, I reached the end of the tunnel. There was another door, this one bigger than the first, and made of thick, heavy wood. It looked ancient, with iron hinges and a large, rusted lock. There was no way I was getting through it, but something about it gave me the creeps. I didn't like the idea of turning my back on it, so I quickly shone my flashlight around the small space, hoping to find something that would explain why this tunnel even existed. And that's when I heard it, a soft shuffling sound, like something moving behind the door. I froze, my heart racing. The noise was faint, but it was there. Something or someone was on the other side of that door. I backed away slowly, not wanting to take my eyes off it. My hands were shaking, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. The shuffling got louder, and then suddenly, it stopped. The silence was deafening, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I stood there, holding my breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And then, without warning, the door creaked open, just a crack. I didn't wait to see what was behind it. I turned and bolted down the tunnel as fast as I could, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. The walls seemed to close in on me as I ran, and I felt like the tunnel was stretching longer, making it harder to reach the exit. My lungs were burning, and my legs felt like jelly. But I didn't stop. I burst out of the tunnel and slammed the small door behind me, gasping for breath. My heart was still racing, and I felt like I was going to be sick. I stood there for a minute, trying to collect myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out of that tunnel. I moved the boxes back in front of the door, covering it up as best I could. I didn't want anyone else to find it, or worse, for whatever was behind that door to find its way out. When I finally made my way back to the front of the store, Sarah looked at me like I'd seen a ghost. I must have been pale and sweating because she asked me if I was okay. I didn't tell her what had happened. I didn't even know how to explain it. I just made some excuse about not feeling well and asked if I could leave early. I didn't go back into that back room again, not alone. Every time I walked past it, I felt a shiver run down my spine, and I could swear I heard that faint shuffling sound, like something was still moving behind that door, waiting. I ended up quitting that job not long after. To this day, I don't know what was behind that second door, and honestly, I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I'll think about it, and I can't help but wonder, what would have happened if I'd stayed just a little longer?